Hi, this is Emerald and welcome to the Diamond Net, and today I'm going to be sharing with you one of the number one skills that you'll need to learn to be effective in your shadow work practice. Alright, so in today's video, I'm going to be sharing with you one of the number one skills that you'll need to learn in order to be effective in your shadow work practice, but let me share a little bit about what shadow work is first. So first off, the term shadow was coined by Swiss psychiatrist Carl Jung to describe the elements of our personality that we repress and that we push away and that we become unconscious to. And what shadow work is it's the process of making the unconscious conscious and reintegrating those repressed parts back into our conscious personality. So you can almost think about the shadow as like a big blind spot that we impose on ourselves to go unconscious to different elements of our inner world. So anything that's in the shadow is truly unconscious to us because it's truly in our blind spot. Now, the skill that I had mentioned that you have to learn in order to be effective in your shadow work practice is to be able to see through your own self-deceptions. So in order to keep the parts of yourself in the shadow and to actually remain unconscious to them, you actually have to have a lot of self-deception mechanisms running and different ways of basically keeping the shadow in the shadow and remaining unconscious to them. And the more you're able to sharpen and strengthen your degree of self-honesty is the degree to which you can actually expand your consciousness and start to reach down with your consciousness into the unconscious. So if you can imagine that the scope of your consciousness is like a light, almost like a diffuser lamp, and depending on how honest or dishonest you are with yourself, the light is either very narrow and contracted or is very wide and expansive, allowing you to see more of yourself. And the ability to spot when we're self-deceiving and also to develop deep levels of self-honesty can be a very difficult skill to learn because we have an identity that we're very attached to. We want to maintain the current structure of our ego. And so if we're holding on to certain qualities that we want to see in ourselves, or maybe we don't want to see certain things about ourselves, this can cause us to kind of put the horse blinders on where we don't want to see certain elements of ourselves. So it's the case that it's actually quite difficult to actually be honest with ourselves when it's something that could undermine our identity or is something that could call our sense of goodness into question. So it goes without saying that the more distance you can get from your own ego and the more you can detach from it, the more self-honest you're able to be and the wider you can kind of kind of shine the light of your consciousness, and the more you're able to be conscious of elements of yourself and integrate them into your conscious personality. Oh, I just wanted to mention I have a new shadow work coaching program called Shadow Work for Self-Sabotage, and it's currently in its pre-enrollment phase. It's going to officially open on July 21st for new students. Right now I have a lot of beta testers in the program kind of testing it out, and so right now it's in pre-enrollment. If you would like to meet me on a discovery call to see if the program is a good fit for you, go ahead and click the link down below in the description box. You can also click the same link if you would like to learn more about the program. So I wanted to share with you an experience that I had, which was actually my very first experience with shadow work before I even knew what shadow work actually was. Now I have to preface this first, that when I was a teenager, between the ages of 16 and 20 years old, I had built up this very specific identity for myself with a very specific persona. And this persona, this identity was like related to certain actions that I would take, the types of art that I liked, even like being with the boyfriend that I was with at the time. It's like so many different things were baked into my identity. And so I had this big identity as a stoner. That's one thing that I'll kind of mention, something that comes up that's interesting about that later on. Also, really attached to the relationship that I was in, and I had this sense of I can make this relationship work out no matter what. I also had this achievement thing where I have to achieve all the time and I have to get all A's in my classes. And all of these things were just like very specific identity criteria that I was really held on to in a really tight way. And I had this really narrow identity and I kept whittling that identity down, trying to refine it and perfect it and perfect it and perfect it. And I went through hill and high water just trying to maintain that identity. Then when I was 20 years old, which is 16 years ago now, I had the opportunity to try ayahuasca on a recreational level. So I had this identity as being like this stoner at the time, and that was like a huge part of like, what I considered my personality to be. And I'd always been interested in like trying other recreational drugs and things like that, because I was like, ooh, that's something that I can add to my identity story. And so that was basically the thought process when I basically had this opportunity to try ayahuasca. And I was like, oh, this is going to be an interesting story, something that I can add to my identity. And so I drank the brew with a few friends, and I was like waiting for the effects to kick in. And one of the very first effects of it is that I started to get this distance from my identity and this distance from my ego. Like I really experienced like an ego transcendence. And in doing that, I could see how often I was having to lie to myself to maintain this very specific identity. And what was funny is that honesty, I was like obsessed with honesty nonstop. Like I would be so honest with like other people to the point where I would almost like over explain things and try to be as thorough as possible. But what was crazy is that I was constantly lying to myself to maintain this identity of mine. And one of the things that was the first thing that came up was like with my relationship that I was really attached to, and that was like really attached into my identity. I realized I didn't want to be in that relationship. So I realized I'd been lying to myself about wanting to be in that relationship just because I was so attached to it, and it had become a part of my identity. And then the next thing I realized is that I don't enjoy smoking weed at all. Like I've always disliked smoking weed, but because it was part of my identity, I didn't realize that I disliked it so much. And so I quit smoking weed. Like after that, I was like, oh, I had no idea that I didn't enjoy it. And so there was just so many different things. And those are like the two big things that I remember from the experience. It has been quite some time ago, but it was almost like I had been keeping my consciousness very, very narrow to maintain this very, very narrow and strict identity. And then once I got that detachment because of the medicine journey that I was on, it's like my consciousness just expanded. And what I experienced was almost like these parts of myself that I'd been pushing down, that I was truly unconscious to, it's like they'd always been kind of there in the background. It was almost like they just kind of like rose back up into my consciousness, and then I was suddenly more whole than I was before. And mind you, this is before I knew anything about shadow work. I started learning about shadow work when I was 23, so this is 3 years before that. And so it was a really interesting experience because the very first thing I experienced was just like, it was almost like ego got some distance, and then it was just clear to me how much I was lying to myself constantly. And so since then, I've been trying to be very vigilant with myself, almost to an obsessive degree, to try to make sure that I'm not lying to myself. And since implementing that practice of radical self-honesty, it's really expanded my scope of consciousness so much. Like before that happened, it's like I really felt like I was almost like, the way I described it before, and this is before that experience, I described it as like I didn't have a lot of room to think. It was almost like my mind was like really bounded in. And that was just because I was holding on to this identity so strongly because it was like attached to my sense of worthiness and value. And, so that attachment to that was also serving this other purpose as well, like getting away from shame and self-hatred. And so I had just narrowed myself down and whittled myself down really, really small through all of these different self-lies that I was constantly telling myself. And so it was like before that, just I've had such a narrow space to think within, and there was just no space for insight. And I could sense that things were even like closing in around the time I was like 19. I was like, I just don't feel like I can get like creative ideas anymore. I don't feel like I can like open up to things. But then after this experience, it was like, oh, it's because I'm lying to myself all the time. And so it's like I need to actually start being really honest so I can start noticing the nuances of my motivations and being really honest with myself about my motivations so that I can have that broader scope of awareness. So let me share with you a few pointers on how to be radically honest with yourself. Now, the first tip that I would give you is to start to notice and be really, really aware of your true motivations behind doing things. So there's one example that I saw actually on like the Bo Burnham special that came out, the Inside special. And there's one little snippet within Inside where he's basically basically he's narrating his thoughts, and then he has commentary over his thoughts, and then he has commentary over the commentary of his thoughts. And basically he's kind of analyzing the whole thing. And that's kind of what you want to set up, where it's like you start to like kind of understand one layer of why you're doing things, but then even the part of you that's doing the interpretation, it's like, okay, why am I interpreting it that way? Like I remember in that particular example that Bo Burnham was like, he was giving some kind of commentary on something, and then he breaks in with another piece of commentary. It's like, yeah, it's like sometimes I feel like if I make commentary on things, that kind of like makes it okay for me to like, you know, say this, whereas otherwise I would think it was pretentious. And then he breaks in with more commentary, and he makes commentary on that commentary. And so it's really about like continuously like going meta and realizing like where your motivations are coming from in the present moment. And that's especially true if you, let's say, if you start to notice like motivations towards things that like maybe it's something that wouldn't jive well with your personality, or like the way that you're more like your identity, the way that you think about yourself. Now, the second tip that I would give you also dovetails off of that, is that it's going to be much more difficult for you to see things about yourself if you have strong judgments toward, let's say, other people who maybe do that same thing. So for example, I used to have this really strong aversion toward people who were attention seekers, and it was like this real like, you know, biting, like I mean I would like, I also identified as non-judgmental, so I would never speak this out loud, but I had this strong judgment toward people who were attention seeking. And then it was one of the things that like came up like later on after that medicine journey when I was 20, that I was like, oh, I'm constantly seeking attention all the time. And so it was like difficult for me to see that about myself, because I had such a strong judgment about other people who would do that. And so the more we can actually exercise compassion towards other people who are doing something that we maybe consider annoying or negative in some way, and really understand, you know, and that's what compassion is. It's this deep level of understanding of like, why is that person doing this thing? And then you can also look at, it's like, okay, if this person's doing that and that bothers me, do I actually have something like that within myself as well? How does that like reflect back into me? And oftentimes with the shadow, we can start to notice little signs and symptoms of the shadow wherever our judgments happen to be. And now my third and final tip that I'll give is to kind of watch out for where you have sensitive spots. Like if you find, like, let's say yourself really defending, you know, certain, let's say, ideas like about your own identity or your worldview, because oftentimes it's like when it comes to identity and worldview, both of those are like kind of combined together as the ego. So it's like anytime you kind of like have like your ego structure, it also kind of clicks into like, let's say, your broader worldview or cosmology. And so you can look at any time that you're trying to defend, let's say, ideas about yourself and like your identity, and like, oh, I'm this way and I'm not that way, or anytime you're trying to defend certain, let's say, worldviews, perspectives, you know, cosmologies, that's where we can find that like shadow material. And so if we can kind of like exercise that like self-honesty when it comes to those elements, we can start to see a little bit deeper underneath sort of the polarizations, you know, toward one side over the other within our identity or within our worldview. You know, so for example, to make it more concrete, let's say that I have a worldview that, like, let's say, maybe it's something like creative people are frivolous and frivolous people are dangerous to society. Let's say it's something really extreme like that. And then I have this identity that I've created that I'm like a serious, no-nonsense person, and that I would never even consider doing anything creative. Well, what's going to happen there is, because there's a really strong judgment, you know, in my worldview associated with creativity, it's going to be really difficult for me to actually see the more creative parts of myself and to integrate them in a way that's positive, because I'm seeing it in such a negative light. And so what I want to do is I want to like almost like open myself up to, let's say, seeing those parts of myself, even if I like, let's say, currently have a worldview where it's like, oh, creativity, it's like the worst thing, the worst quality that you can have. Even if I think that, it's like I want to be able to face into the shame around that quality that's maybe been conditioned into me, and to be able to really kind of love myself anyway. And I use creativity because usually we don't think about that as like a very negative quality, but there are certainly certain qualities that we would have a really strong shame narrative around it's actually quite positive that we can tap into, sort of untapped potentials if we're able to be honest with ourselves and really see those elements and integrate those into our personality. So yeah, you want to watch out for any time that you have really, really strong, let's say polarized viewpoints, or like, anything that's like, a really strong identity belief, that scaffolds down to a really polarized or black and white worldview belief. Oftentimes that's where you can find sort of, let's say, conscious symptoms of the shadow. The shadow itself is unconscious, but oftentimes it's like these areas where we're trying to defend ourselves shows us almost like the place where our X marks the spot, and we can kind of dig there and find our shadow underneath that. Anyway, so that's all I have for you for now. I hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, go ahead, click the like button down below and subscribe and leave me a comment down below. And also, yeah, if you wanted to meet me on a discovery call or to learn more about my Shadow Work for Self-Sabotage group coaching program, which is for ambitious people who are dealing with self-sabotage and procrastination and that sort of thing, who want to use shadow work to unwire those procrastinating behaviors at the roots, go ahead and click the link down below in the description box and just check that out. Or you can also schedule a free discovery call with me to see if the program is a good fit for you. Also, if you would like to learn more about shadow work, you can click this link right here. And until next time, keep becoming more you.